Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Beyza Aynal. I'm a senior research fellow at the International Security Program at Chatham House. I'm delighted to be chairing today's event on towards a more resilient future for cities. At Chatham House, we formed a working group on revitalizing resilience in light of coronavirus pandemic, and today's discussion fits really well into our efforts on resilience. Now, let me introduce the issues a little bit that today we are going to discuss. We know that the capacity to detect, contain, and respond to biological threats, such as COVID-19, varies considerably across the world. And while some countries are better prepared and were better prepared than others, not much focus has actually been given to local levels of governance, cities, towns, or urban areas in general, in responding to these type of challenges. Today, we gathered a fantastic group of experts who will discuss how governments, businesses, and citizens can work together to build more resilient cities. What factors are affecting cities' abilities to address the current pandemic, and what lessons can we learn from the current crisis to build more resilient cities in the longer term? Let me introduce you to our speakers in order. We have Guy Granger with us. Guy is a EMEA Chief Executive at NYCs listed real estate services company JLL, where he also sits on the Global Executive Board. Guy plays a leading and active role in the fight to tackle the climate crisis. Our second speaker is Shirley Rodriguez. Shirley is the Deputy Mayor of London for Environment and Energy. She was previously working as the Acting Director for Climate Change at the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. Our third speaker is Daniel Zarilli. Daniel is New York City's Chief Climate Policy Advisor and One NYC Director. He's responsible for preparing NYC for the future and delivering on New York City's Green New Deal. Each panelist will keep their remarks up to 5 to 7 minutes maximum. Guy, without further ado, I would like to start with you. How do you see the space needed for people to live in the cities after COVID-19? And how should we be rethinking and redefining the cities? Thanks.
Thanks very much. Well, I think we're seeing a lot of talk actually about how people are going to change after this. But I think when we talk about resilient cities, there are two aspects that we have to consider, because resilience is all about how you adapt to change. And there isn't just the change of COVID happening. I mean, that is a short, sharp shock. And we're going to hear from London and New York as to sort of how difficult that is. But there are also long-term changes, trends and shifts that are structurally happening that cities have to adapt to, whether that be about technology, transport, climate, or indeed demographic changes. And we are advisors, service providers in the built environment space. So really we look at those shifts in demand. What do people want, whether it's where they live, where they work, or where they play? And that really helps us to guide whether it be the occupiers, whether you're occupying a building in any of those aspects, or whether you're investing. And what we're seeing actually is that what people want now from a city is very different from the way cities were designed originally. So even if it's just the housing requirements, the apartments, particularly for developed cities or the heritage cities, aren't necessarily fit for purpose for what people want in the future. So there is a lot of urban redesign that needs to take place. And there's a lot of change to the way we manage urban spaces, which has to happen. And technology is really going to be able to enhance this. And I think the important thing is that in the future, cities need to be designed for people, not pollution. So often cities in the past were designed for transport, to get transport in and out, whether that's supplies or actual sort of human beings. Whereas now, connectivity is very, very different. And I think when we look at that, we understand that the long-term criteria that cities need to use in terms of measuring their success shouldn't just be based on GDP, although actually employment opportunity will still be a major attractor for people to come to cities. But what we're seeing in terms of the demand is quality of life is coming through as one of the biggest criteria that people are using about where they live and where they work. So I've heard lots of commentators to say, oh, people won't be coming to big cities, they'll be moving out into the countryside. I don't totally believe that. I mean, there's lots of different people out there who have different measures, but that combination between job prospects, quality of life, amenities, heritage, innovation is going to be very, very important. And it's great to hear from London and New York, some of the most innovative and diverse cities out there. You know, it should be a resilient criteria to use for the future. I think the really interesting thing is that as we go through this crisis, public and private bodies, and within cities, the two have to work together, are facing sort of quite short-term challenges. And whether that's in the private sector, an economic challenge about sort of profits, or in a public sector about re-election. And I think cities have to sort of transcend that and come up with sort of long-term visions and a strategy that then public and private can actually combine forces to get things done and actually execute on those. And the key thing going forward, I think, which is different from the past, is that we can really use technology, digital and data to track success, and the amount of embodied technology within the built environment that we could use to really sort of monitor how these cities are doing in terms of air quality, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of congestion, is going to be really, really, it's going to be really impressive actually. And I'm really interested to hear, what the cities are seeing, because we're in a unique space at the moment where cities are quite empty from traffic, and actually people are seeing, wow, this is a great place to be. So I think the future looks bright, but it needs long-term visions and strategies that are capable of combating both those structural shifts that are taking place and the acute shocks.
Thank you very much, Guy. I'm going to turn to Shirley now. Listening in Guy's presentation, I would like to, in a way, start the discussion on the specific cases. And Shirley, you're coming from the London perspective. Can you talk to us a little bit about the experience in London and the efforts that London is undertaking to improve its resilience against any type of shocks, probably?
Thanks, Beza, and also some interesting points from Guy that we are working on in London and many other cities. And I think there's a reason why cities exist, and they will exist. People want to live in them, and it's absolutely right that they're made resilient and they respond to how people want to live. So that quality of life issue is really important. But Beza, I talk a little bit about how the pandemic is affecting London and our resilience. This isn't a shock to people, but it's really highlighted the sort of weaknesses and vulnerabilities that we face as cities, but as countries. We've seen massive shocks to supply and demand, disruption of supply chains, loss of freedoms that people have accepted, but massive pressures on our health and social care systems, and really importantly, highlighting the exacerbation of existing inequalities. And London hasn't been any different to other cities or other countries. But one of the reasons why I believe that there has been such a problem in the UK and in London is we've seen a lot of underinvestment in infrastructure and people and the sort of institutions that support living in cities over the past 10 years, during the austerity period here in the UK following the financial crash. And that's meant our infrastructure has not been ready. And that when we faced a pandemic, there was massive pressure on that infrastructure, but also green spaces. People who don't have access in London to green spaces readily on their doorstep. So those sorts of things were really highlighted. We also realised that even though we had done some planning at UK level and London level, it was inadequate, and coming together, we were slow. And that's not to say that city governments and local governments haven't acted magnificently. You know, they've come together and really tried to put stuff into place, and, you know, to try and keep people safe, you know, taking homeless people off the street and putting them into hotels, responding to some of the social care issues. But this is at the same time as seeing massive falls in our income. Our business rates, our local taxation has fallen dramatically. And in the meantime, local authorities have had to find the money to respond to that crisis. Now, that is a looming crisis that we've got to now deal with. And today, if anybody's seen the Mayor of London's announcement today, the budget pressures that the sort of GLA and local authorities in London are facing, it's big. Across the UK, they're talking about something in the order of £13 billion being paid out to tackle the crisis that hasn't been reimbursed, and we haven't got the wherewithal to cover that off. This is against government borrowing in the order of 80 billion, I think, since March. And we've seen our transport system under pressure, you know, huge crashes in the sort of fare income that Transport for London received. And we know that's going to carry on for some time, because in order to socially distance safely on the tube, capacity has to drop to about 15% of what it was before, which means something in the order of 8 million trips have to be dealt with every day through walking and cycling, but ideally people staying at home and not making those trips. And what we want to avoid is that car-based recovery. So I think the other thing I'd want to point out is the unevenness of the impact. So the inequalities that existed before, we've seen in the UK a recognition that people who are the poorest and from Black and minority ethnic groups have been are more likely to have been affected by COVID. And this is partly because of the socioeconomic issues that were there before. And we know that climate is going to make a real difference, and so we need to address those. So in terms of some of the lessons that I draw out, just for, you know, in terms of sort of how the city might respond to climate change, we've understood that the lack of data has meant that we've not been able to target our efforts properly. And certainly on inequalities, we know that because we don't record the ethnicity of people who have died on their death certificates, we didn't know how big an issue this was, and then also how we might respond to it. And I think the other issues I talked about was we have a multiplicity of agencies working across London, local government, businesses, government, and so on. And there's been a lack of clarity on accountabilities, which again has meant our response has been very slow. But there have been some silver linings. You know, Guy talked a little bit about the empty streets and the clean air. And we want to try and embed that. Many people have said they want to not return to business as usual. They want cleaner air and so on. But we're already, unfortunately, seeing car levels returning to pre-COVID days already, despite having reintroduced the ultra-low emission zone, the congestion charging and so on. But people say they want to do that. So, you know, we're pressing ahead with our street space plan, for example, which is trying to make those changes a bit more embedded and make sure that we lock those in. So I won't go on because I think there's lots of things we can talk about, but I would say, and you mentioned it, Beza, that, you know, prevention and planning is absolutely key. This has been a dress rehearsal for you know, a shock, as Guy has said, for some longer term problems that we know are coming down the line. So we have the time to prepare. You know, we prepared resilience strategies. We work with other cities like New York and through the C40 to really collaborate. And I think that's one good thing that has really come out of this crisis, that the fact that global collaboration, best practice sharing, but even at a local neighbourhood level, the sort of self-help groups that communities have come together has really highlighted there is an opportunity there and a willingness there to act at speed. So, you know, so that gives me hope that we, as a city, can really help get ready and prepare for the climate crisis that is coming.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Shirley. Daniel, I believe you are involved in the climate discussions within New York City. And listening, Shirley, like, how would you take this on board? Would you give us a little bit about the background, the briefing outline of how New York City is continuing to work on its climate change efforts while coping with COVID-19? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Beza. And thanks to Chatham House for having me here today, and to all my fellow panelists. You know, like much of the globe in this moment, we've been through a lot in New York City. We've been at one of the the top epicenters of this COVID crisis, over 20,000 confirmed and probable COVID deaths. We're seeing that disproportionately among Black and brown New Yorkers. There's been massive job loss, particularly in our retail and service economy, which is, at the lower end of the income scale. And there's real strains on our healthcare and social infrastructure. And then, like Shirley mentioned with London, not to mention the impacts to the city's finances, where we've seen, billions of dollars in revenue gone over the next, this fiscal year and next fiscal year. And that money is just so important for our ability to spur the recovery. So we've had certainly a tough spring. As we're now entering summer, all the trends are finally in a much better place, moving in a much different direction. And we've been, we're now in phase 1 of our own reopening process and hoping to get into phase 2 very soon. But, like Shirley mentioned, in so many ways, this global health emergency has really been, it's an early preview of how our climate crisis is going to unfold, with threats to lives and livelihoods, strains on our infrastructure and communities, and then clearly the disparate impacts felt among our most marginalized. And this health crisis will eventually end, but we will still be facing down this changing climate when we get out of this. And so for us in New York, it's just no time to lose sight of our looming climate crisis and the threats to public health and well-being that it will cause. Instead, we see this as an opportunity to emerge stronger and more resilient by prioritizing a fair and a green recovery with clean energy infrastructure, job creation, environmental justice, because this recovery in so many ways is really one of the last best chances that we have to get it right and to choose a new future to avert all these worst consequences that we know are coming from climate change, with rising seas and heat and storms and all of those impacts and social impacts that are coming at us going forward. So that all sounds nice. What's that actually look like in practice? Well, here in New York City, we're committed to ending the age of fossil fuels. And for us, that's a starting point for all of this, and making sure that we're investing in clean energy climate solutions as part of our own Green New Deal, our One NYC program. Mayor de Blasio signed an executive order this year, putting a new set of policies in place that effectively are banning new fossil fuel infrastructure serving New York City and making that opposition to projects like Williams Pipeline and other gas infrastructure. That's our default position going forward. It's why we're divesting our pension funds from fossil fuels, which are dragging down our investments. And thanks certainly to Shirley for your partnership on that effort through C40. And it's why we enacted ambitious building retrofit mandates last year for existing buildings and adopted strict energy codes for new buildings, because we have to halt the carbon pollution at its source. 70% of New York City's greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings in our city. So all this is critical, of course, but it's not enough just to say no to the fossil fuels. We need to say yes to the job-creating investments in clean energy, things like solar power, offshore wind, hydropower. It's all so much more incredibly important now, because we know that investing in this clean infrastructure and resilient infrastructure over the next decade will really spur our economy and create the enormous numbers of good paying and accessible jobs that we need in this moment when our economy is suffering the worst unemployment since the Great Depression. And so a few weeks ago, we took the first steps on how to really center climate in our own recovery when Mayor de Blasio announced a number of efforts focused on what it will mean to create a fair recovery from this crisis. And he specifically put climate and environmental justice at the heart of those efforts, and joining together with Mayor Khan and a few dozen other mayors to endorse the C40 recovery principles that will prioritize the social equity, the climate action, community resilience, and the science-based action as part of that COVID recovery. And we think this ultimately over the long term pays for itself with cleaner air, better health outcomes, avoided damages from severe storms, and a renewed economy, a livable economy that leads the world in renewable energy, and also rights the environmental injustices of the past that we've seen and that continue to play out, whether it's in a COVID and a public health emergency, the things that we're going to see coming at us from climate change, all of the social equity concerns that we continue to face if we're not really willing to, that we need to focus on dealing with the systemic racism and other challenges that we have here in New York City and across the US for sure. And so I guess to wrap all this up, we've emerged stronger after tragedy before in New York City, and whether it was 9/11 or Hurricane Sandy or the Great Recession just in the last several decades, our current challenges are no less potent, but the opportunity right now is pivotal. But that putting solving the climate crisis at the heart of the recovery from this pandemic at the scale and pace that's required to really deal with climate change. That's what's important for us in order to make sure that we're changing these unsustainable practices that have pushed our planet to the brink. It may be our last best chance, and this climate decade of really making sure we can bend the curve on greenhouse gas emissions over the next decade. This is our moment to get it right, and this is our moment to choose a better future. And so that's why we're continuing to focus and center all of our climate and environmental justice work through this recovery. So it's a little bit about New York City was doing, and I'll hand it back to you, Beza.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. I'm going to now open the questions to the Q&A in a way. There have been like a lot of points to tease out and to go. In the Q&A session, I would like the audience to start typing down their questions into the Q&A box that they will see on the Zoom on the right-hand side at the low-hand side. But while waiting for the questions to come in, I'm going to do the chair's prerogative and put forward a few questions to the speakers. Now, I guess I'll just start with the other way. So I'll just start with Daniel first. You mentioned about recovery, and I think the theme of today really goes to resilience, preparedness, and then planning, and the recovery is actually a very important part of it. The question that I have in mind is part of resilience is also adaptation. And some of the points that are raised already coming up in terms of adaptation, but do you think that there will be a new normal for New York City or for London as well? I think, Shirley, if you want to take the same question. And how can we adapt to that new normal? And how do cities need to adapt to that new normal? Thank you.
Yeah, I think, and I think Guy alluded to some of this in his remarks. I think, anyone that thinks they know all the aspects of this, it probably is not quite getting it right. But I think identifying these key points around there will be changes to come, that things that are going to be locked in our cities that we're going to be living with for quite some time, and the social distancing requirements, how that plays out in office buildings, how that plays out in our transit networks, the need, like Shirley mentioned, to think about taking some stress off of our core sort of subway and bus networks and thinking about safer streets and bike infrastructure and all of these pieces. I think there's an opportunity to get this right, not just in a temporary way, but to think it through about how we can, how those can continue to evolve and serve the needs of New Yorkers and other city residents over the long term, and how that continues to evolve. Because I think, there's so much I think that we're going to learn from this, that, we've seen reduced traffic on our streets, we've seen cleaner air in our cities. And I think it's showing people that there's a better way, and that there's it's putting a vision out there of something that we can, aspire to, because unfortunately we're not going to keep those impacts away in the short term. Unfortunately, congestion and air pollution and other things are going to come back as all the normal systems and infrastructure we have, will turn itself back on in a recovery process as the economy restarts and those things. But if it teaches us anything, it's that we actually can, through when we come together and take collective action and think about our neighbors, and we can do things at scale that have really big impact. And for me, I think that's a really key lesson for the needs that we have on our climate crisis, that we can come together and have big impact, but we need to find now ways to sustain it, because it's not sustained in this current moment. So I'm heartened by different things that we're seeing about how we use our street space, the different models of work collaboration that we have, being able to be in London today without hopping on a plane and have this conversation. I think there's so many things that we're going to want to figure out how to make them more sustained over the long term. And I think that's going to be a positive outcome that we all need to aspire to on this.
I think similarly to London, to New York, this has been an unwanted experiment. The opportunity to look at how we live differently, almost overnight, the whole of the GLA, was working at home, as many other businesses were, and the system seems to work. We are still working. It's not, ideal, I think, but it's highlighted there are different ways of doing things, and people actually do like, notwithstanding sort of caring responsibilities, and it's not ideal not having, the way that we're working at the moment, but there is something there that we know that we can do more of this. So how do we capitalize on the good parts and improve the not so good parts? We know that the reduction in road traffic, people are now seeing how it is to walk on streets that are quiet and not full of that diesel smell and are safe. And so want to embed that. And we're seeing loads of people around London asking for school streets. So outside there's schools, the streets to be closed so that so they can safely and socially, in a socially distanced way, get kids back to school and so on. And, how might they go and shop locally and work locally? There are things, Guy talked about design. We think, and we've talked about this a lot, about how to make people work, enable people to work and live more locally. People sort of are shopping in local independent shops now, getting to know their neighbourhoods, getting to know their neighbours. So these are all good things that people are saying they want to keep. Now, obviously, as things start to go back, because people are worried about their incomes and so on, you start to see the increase in car traffic. But there are measures that we have been putting in place in London, and other cities have been doing the same, that the mayor is saying that will stay, that we are going to reintroduce, we are going to extend the ultra low emission zone out to the north and south circular. We have got building codes like New York where, for zero carbon, we want to see those accelerated. And as part of our recovery process, we also have embedded the sort of Green New Deal approach into our recovery. So while we're looking at economic and social recovery, it absolutely has to be a green recovery. And that means making sure that people have the new high quality green jobs that are out there, that they're enabled to live the lives that they want to live, that the inequalities in access to green spaces, the inequalities in terms of how air pollution falls on the most vulnerable, people who don't even cause the problem because they don't own cars. How do we make sure that we address those to really make our cities really great places to live? And the opportunity now is to make those improvements that we've had to bring in for COVID, dealing with COVID, how to make those legacy improvements and really build off that, and capitalize on what people are saying to us that they want to see.
Guy, do you have any points to add on this, especially in terms of the tech points that you raised? I think if you can link it to that approach as well, it would be really interesting.
I'll definitely come on to that. I mean, I think what's interesting about this period we've been in is that this extremely sort of quick velocity to life and the economy has slowed down in this period. And so we've had a chance to reflect, but we should not kid ourselves that people are creatures of habit. And there is a real danger that despite all the talk, less will change than we think, right? Because things will only change if we actually create that change. And I think there'll be a lot of eyes on the recovery in terms of actually, when cities put these policies in place, is anything in practical terms really changing? And I believe that, I do believe that this is a moment in time that is, I think Daniel called it the last best chance. I think there's a great way of describing it. But nevertheless, leaders and city leaders and groups will have to be brave and be very courageous, because for this change to happen, it will require serious change in decision making, serious change in approach and the ways we work, because we will have to get some velocity back into the system. And there are plenty of barriers in the way of change. What I would say is there is a huge amount of capital out there, which is very different from the global recession. There's an enormous amount of capital out there, and a lot of it is being pumped into real estate. And we've got real evidence of the fact that investment into green real estate, into net zero real estate, shows higher returns. And the reason we can get that evidence is because we track it through embedded technology. And that has never happened in the past. So I would really encourage, and I think London and New York will lead the way, but I really encourage all cities to be really courageous in terms of those environmental targets, because you will get capital to support you, whether that's private or public funding or both, and it can be tracked. That success can be tracked, and the return on investment is definitely better.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Guy.
No, I just add to Guy's point about the bravery of city leaders. I think absolutely, and Mayor Khan, Mayor de Blasio, many others, but it really does need citizens to demand it. And I think that's what we are seeing. So I think there's a lot of encouragement, I think, from the polling that we're doing, from the letters that have been written into Sadiq, but also, there's a consensus about all the stakeholders around our recovery board. These are businesses, these are NGOs, these are church and other faith groups, all talking about not wanting to return to what was normal and business as usual. There is a new normal and people want something different because they've seen that. I completely agree with Guy. We've seen some horrific scenes over the, just the last couple of days where people have been sort of, as lockdown has lifted and people charging off to go shopping in Bicester and, but I think that is, yes, that there is always some element of the population that are going to do that. I think it's beholden on city leaders, but also business leaders and other community leaders to really say that isn't right. This is the new normal that we're heading for, and it's the right thing for all of us to aim for that, and work with us to help that recovery effort.
Now, one of our audience members, Sue Newton, is asking the question, you have mentioned climate change as a key risk. What are the other major risks you see as needing to be tackled in the future to ensure resilience? Who would like to take that question?
Why don't I take it first, and then we can lead into some practical examples. I mean, I think it's affordability. I think it's that whole aspect of inequality, which we've all talked about on this panel. And I think that what has been amazing with the growth of both London and New York and their success, their global success as these major sort of gateway cities. And I live and work in London, and I've educated my children in London, so I'm bear witness to it, is that actually they're pretty unaffordable places as well, if you get it wrong. So I think that is a real challenge, and everyone's identified it, and recent events have really exposed it even more than ever, that urban areas are, places where side by side, we have these very different things going on. And I think that's a major challenge for us all.
Anyone else who would like to go? Daniel?
Happy to jump in. I mean, Guy has it exactly right. Like the inequality crisis and how it plays itself out in, affordability and economic security, and what we talk about in New York City as health and wealth inequities are there. It's straining, and we're seeing it play out now in the U.S. It's really straining this idea of a social compact and how we come together as a nation to solve collective problems. And what we're seeing with COVID and what we will be, experiencing through climate change is, these stresses that are just applied to our urban areas that have this social inequity challenge. We have old infrastructure that we're trying to renew. We have the legacy of decision-making around how we, where we put housing and infrastructure and what it's meant in certain communities. And we need to get to the heart of those problems if we're really going to have a successful answer to some of these challenges that are coming at us, that are going to continue to look like, yes, public health threats and climate threats and cybersecurity risks and the sort of, the full spectrum of things that are being applied to us. But it's our internal stresses, I think, that are pulling us most apart at this point, because we haven't dealt with the social inequities. At least in the US, I can speak for, we haven't really dealt with these challenges in a way that's playing itself out. And we see it in our statistics on poverty numbers, or it's on our premature mortality numbers, that it's very, it plays out very different based on race. And also like the linkage between race and place in the US, and some of the segregation that has played itself out from redlining and other things, that we see all the same problems pop on all the same maps in the same places. It's the same neighborhoods that have been disinvested, and the environmental injustice. And, fixing those underlying problems will ultimately build out the larger coalition of voices and people that we need to solve these and adapt through the global challenges that are getting thrown at us, whether they be public health or climate or, digital and other things. So I think it's right on to name the inequality as one of the top underlying factors in all this that's going to make our ability to deal with the other challenges that much harder.
I'd agree with that, and it's no coincidence that the numbers and levels of deaths from COVID, or even from prematurely brought forward deaths from air pollution, mirror the local authority areas, the boroughs, the wards in London that are the ones that are most vulnerable, the poorest, the ones with the highest populations of Black and minority ethnic people, the ones where the income inequalities are really stark. So I think absolutely, affordability issue, the inequality issue, they're the massive ones that underlie and cut through all the other risks that we face from, I mentioned earlier, anything from diseases to terrorism to Brexit to whatever, how they fall on our population and how they impact on the sort of cohesion of the city is something that we're grappling with and really trying to tackle as part of our recovery efforts. As I mentioned, Sadiq has talked about that being, a cleaner, greener, fairer, that the fairer issue is absolutely up there.
We have another question from Richard Betten. He asked, does the panel believe that the Amsterdam donut model has a positive part to play in addressing the environmental and societal issues on a holistic basis? And not only this question, I think there's another question that also links again to city resilience and environmental and societal issues, which comes from Simon Hodson. He says, clearly one of the biggest challenges is mobility and the need for a fundamental review of mobility shift around cities, and therefore the funding of infrastructure. Cycling is an option, but an unrealistic, inclusive long-term option. How can we remodel our cities without dismantling, quote unquote, the civic and cultural aspect of our cities? That's the second question I have. So the first question is really about the Amsterdam donut model, whether you believe that it's the environmental and societal issues to be a holistic model or not. Who would like to go first? Guy, I think you are going. Yes.
I can definitely talk to Amsterdam. Because when we talk about courage, Amsterdam and the Netherlands often come out pretty well. Clearly, that is a culture that's used to living with environmental challenge, the fact that the country is virtually underwater. So they've been there for a while. But I think circularity and the circular economy is something that gets missed often when we talk about net zero and we talk about carbon. And Shirley, you mentioned it earlier about the supply chain. And this concept of actually the resources that we're using, and particularly the developed world, the resources that we are consuming from the natural resources of this planet are just too great. And cities are one of the reasons for this, and the urbanization. So I think it's a very bold move. I actually haven't quite worked out how they're going to execute on it and measure it. To a certain extent, Amsterdam potentially is of a size where that model can be applied and then scaled to larger cities. I think the challenges with the much bigger cities are just the sheer scale and the number of different stakeholders that are involved. But I have to say, I admire what the Netherlands and the Nordics countries do generally in Europe to lead the way on this. I think, particularly on circularity in terms of reusing, repurposing, and last resort recycling, as nations, they're well ahead of the rest. And I think the cities are starting to adopt that. So I think it's admirable. Let's see how they track it, and if we can apply it, let's try and scale it. I mean, let's not reinvent it if they do well.
I think it's an interesting model, and there are lots of different ways of assessing the environmental impacts of a city, its citizens, and its environs. We've been, through my career, and I'm sure yours as well. There's been footprinting. There's there are the SDGs. There's the donut model. loads of indices and so on. I think the point is to make sure that you understand where where your impacts are, and how and to set the really tough policies and targets that will get there. The other issue is making sure that you take an integrated approach, which we tried to do in London. So we set some very tough targets, we've got some good policies, but understanding that one policy may have an impact on another. So taking those things in the round is really important. There's lots of things to learn from Amsterdam and other cities. You talked about the Nordics, but also, some of the things that we've been doing in London, we've taken from other cities around the world. So I think, I alluded to this in my remarks. The best practice sharing is absolutely critical. Then applying it to how it works in your city. I'm really jealous about what New York are able to do about building codes and retrofit. We don't have those powers. We are lobbying government for the powers and the ability to retrofit our homes, which has masses of emissions that we're not able to touch. So our focus has largely been on transportation. We know that our consumption emissions, even though London has peaked its emissions, we are 3 times our emissions, and we haven't got, haven't really started on trying to tackle those, although we are working on making London we're one of the EMF flagship cities on circular economy, working to look at how we might get some of our developers, for example, to publish circular economy statements. So when they do new developments, that we're looking at how they take that approach. So obviously we need to move much faster, and I think the opportunities that this crisis has brought is enabling us to try and push faster on some of these policy areas where we have the powers to do so.
Thanks a lot, Shirley. I have another question from Peter Hurst. How much capability and resources do you think cities need to exist sustainably, and are those presently experienced, they're sufficient? And I think this question actually links to the whole approach on the economy. Cities in general provide a large portion of a country's economy, and I think London and New York City is a good example for that. And any kind of shock, disturbance that happens to the city or to the critical national infrastructure of the city, we would see a huge impact on the economy. So how do you see that? What would be the requirement? What would you need to function sustainably, and where would be the private sector role on this?
I think it's a really important question, and when we think about New York City provides, I think it's on the order of about 8 or 9% of the entire U.S. GDP. It's pretty clear that there's no national recovery in the U.S. without a New York City recovery in all this. And so, we have certainly supported and stepped up when others have faced crises and natural disasters and other things to help support our neighbors and friends across the U.S. and certainly across the world in these moments. This is a moment when federal help in New York City is going to be incredibly important. And we're seeing this all across the country. Of course, state and local governments are being strained, payrolls are being strained, ability to provide vital public services is being challenged. And this is a moment when we're going to be able to do a lot of things, and we've shown that we can step up and do a lot of things to support the recovery and support our healthcare infrastructure and feed New Yorkers and do all these things that are necessary in the immediate response. But the long-term recovery it's going to be more challenging. It's going to play out over a longer period of time if we don't get that federal help that we need in this moment to make sure that we can restart New York City, and that has ripple effects across our entire nation. So I think it's a really important moment, and there's been a lot of ongoing conversations in Washington around what different stimulus and recovery programs look like. I don't think those conversations are done, and I think more needs to ultimately come if we're going to be able to support state and local governments and their ability to support local businesses and all the infrastructure changes that are needed, and to really be able to have to spur that courage that Guy and Shirley mentioned. It's critical that we're able to come together, not just in individual cities basis, but as much as possible on a regional and a national basis to get that done.
Same issue in London, in the UK. We're we are such a driver of the UK economy, but there is an agenda now, and pre-COVID, of levelling up, which was already impacting on on the ability of London to access some of those fundings. So we are lobbying hard that the UK can't recover from COVID without London also recovering. But I think what the mayor and other mayors around the country have been talking about is devolve the powers and the fiscal powers for them to get on and work with their partners and raise the finances that they need, understanding the demands of their locality, and then so that we're able to raise finance from the markets and so on. Without those powers and fiscal incentives that the mayors can then choose, we are hamstrung really in really pushing ahead, because we're reliant on advocating to government for funding, bidding for pots of money. We have sources of funding that are now close to us because we're no longer in the European Union. So all of those things are a problem for us. But there is huge opportunity. Guy talked about, there is capital markets out there. Our problem is making sure there's the revenue now in order to get that pipeline going, not just within the Greater London Authority, but in the local authorities, but also other public agencies as well.
Guy, would you like to take this question as well, or should I continue?
No, that's
Do you have
fine.
any remarks?
I'd just back up what Shirley said. Actually, having that responsibility and accountability is really important. So those devolved powers, I mean, it's hard to deliver if you've got one hand tied behind your back. And I think the cities that do have devolved powers are able to execute long-term strategies better.
Perfect. I'm going to raise another question, but before that, I would just like to tell the audience that we have only 10 minutes left. So if you have been hesitating whether you wanted to put the question or not, it's just the time to do that, because I'll address that question for sure. The question that I have in mind is about value proposition, and we talked about this offline with all of you, that sometimes the decision maker, most of the time, the decision makers are good at responding to imminent threats, right? And the threats that are invisible and intangible just go off from their minds. And that's why I think, Shirley, you've been also talking about the preparedness mechanisms, the COVID-19 and climate change in general for the whole group. So how can we actually prevent that short-term focus on fundamental issues such as climate change or COVID-19, and create a long-term approach in a way? I think that's really fundamental, but the way that the politicians or decision makers think needs to shift. Would any one of you want to take that question?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that, because I think, we have some natural, benefits on this in New York City, and that we've, over the last 12 and 13 years, have set up structures to do long-term planning, and those there's a built-in accountability, annual reports. There's every 4 years we update those plans, and we're forced to think about over the next several decades where do we want to be pointing ourselves toward. But it's also a reality, and it's true that the divorce of short-term priorities and long-term needs, it's a hard one to bridge in government, because and I'm sure this is true in the private sector, there's a lot of short-term demands, whether they be quarterly filings or election cycles. And it leads you to a place where, even in these recovery moments, there's a big tendency to be looking backward and fighting the last war, and let's make sure that thing never happens again. We had a really good, example of how we've done this in a different way after Hurricane Sandy here in New York City, where there was a big pressure and a lot of conversation in the city on, let's make sure that never happens again, and let's put all of our efforts on making sure the next hurricane, the next Sandy, that we're better prepared for that. And at the time, we were able to create the space politically and publicly to widen our aperture and think more broadly about not just coastal storms, but what's the full range of climate risks, and ultimately put forward a whole set of initiatives and programs, $20 billion of investments, to make sure that we are thinking about heat, and we're thinking about sea level rise and the other risks. And it's a good model that requires the political leadership and capital to create the space to be able to think about those issues in a way that's slightly apart from the immediate recovery and response functions that the city needs to do, but ultimately over a course of months and years, ultimately has to merge into those streams of work. And it's a delicate balance to be able to get that right, and to create the space to think long term, and ultimately widen the set of risks that are out there, the sort of the low frequency but high impact things that are out there. Those are your moments to actually be able to think about them, because there's almost no other space to really insert those kinds of known risks and known unknowns that are out there that are facing cities. It's not easy to get right, and I'm sure we don't always get it right, even when we think we get it right, but it's so vital to create that space and to create the structures of accountability around thinking about those long-term risks and finding the ways to insert it into the normal operations of city. And it's a hard balance.
Guy, I think you wanted to jump in. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's a really hard one, actually. What's value to one person is a cost to someone else. And but I think the area where it is possible to drive a clear value proposition and to set long-term targets which go across parties from a political perspective is on environmental matters. And because that's a clear emergency, it's a matter for the citizenship and all the stakeholders within, whether public or private. It's measurable. I mean, there are different measures, but it is measurable. And there is a clear value proposition to all of the stakeholders as well, from the public sector in terms of quality of life for the people that live there, in terms of the private sector, clear proof that there are better returns from those types of investments. And so, I mean, we try and cover everything, but in terms of value proposition where you can target some long-term metrics, I think there is no excuse for not putting in place an environmental strategy to make the cities greener, to make the cities produce less waste and more resourceful. I think that's there to be done, and it's a clear responsibility for leaders and all the stakeholders within it. I mean, the good thing is that there is a case for it producing returns as well, all round. So, I'm a great believer in that, and we have a lot of clients who are prepared to put their capital behind it and get into extremely long-term relationships with cities. If you think about it, it is quite circular, actually, because they're reinvesting the capital that was generated through the enterprise in the cities. I mean, over the last 10 years, an enormous amount of wealth has been created in the world. Now, a lot of that is sitting with pension funds, with sovereign wealth, with these companies that are going to reinvest it on behalf of us. And they are very, very focused on investing into positive carbon impact, effectively. And so I think, rather than covering it all, when you talk about value proposition and long-term prospects, that you can go cross-party and collaborate with private, focus on the environmental ones.
Perfect, thanks, Guy. Shirley, we have around 4 minutes left. Just
to say, that's absolutely right. We've set long-term strategies, as has many other cities, New York and so on, out to 2050. We've set out our 1.5 degree plan. We have our climate action plans and so on. We know what needs to happen. I think, as I said before, we need the powers and the funding to do that. We have collaborations with the private sector, with our pension funds. With New York, we're leading a divest and invest group. How do we get out of fossil fuels and reinvest that money into, low carbon, zero carbon infrastructure? So absolutely critical. So I think you're right. But unless we have the whole package, and the problem isn't, not everybody has that. But the big next opportunity is the stimulus packages that countries are bringing forward. That's where the challenge needs to be made to our government, to the US government and others. Where are the green strings on the investments they're bringing forward? They're talking a good talk, but not yet seeing the real commitment to the long-term environment yet.
Amazing. Thank you very much. I truly appreciate this discussion. I think went really great. And I think we have discussed a lot of issues that relate to resilience, but also got into the whole idea about recovery and how we should be thinking about recovery and climate change at the same time, and addressing really key issues that are high impact issues that will have high consequences, maybe low probability, but in the future that cities are going to face. So I'm really happy actually to see that all of you have this long-term vision and a drive for the cities that you're representing. And I hope that other cities would also be taking on board some of the discussion that we had today. We will definitely continue discussion around local governance structures and the role of cities in the future. Thank you all for listening in and sending questions to our way. And many thanks to our speakers. I think the panel is now closed. Thank you very much.